Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm here with Susan Catto. I'm Leah Eichler, and we have a new series called
Still a Classic.
So in this new series, we're going to discuss, we will pick various books, maybe even some films, yet to be decided, and we will argue if the works still decide or still merit being called a classic.
And, the definition of classic is going to vary person to person, but generally, I think for the purposes of this podcast, we would describe it as a book that was, well reviewed in its time, maybe a big hit. If it was written hundreds of years ago, it's still being read today or put onto curricula.
Correct.
And, that caused a certain, fuss and furor around the popular readership too.
Sure, like a cultural touchstone. I mean, there are books that we still talk about that may not be critical works of literature,
right,
but they left a huge impression on our cultural psyche.
Yeah, and we're going to be dealing with both on this show, both the ones that would fit in anyone's list of the 100 greatest books of all time, or the ones that would be like, you go on to Goodreads and see what's on the 100 favorite books of all time.
Right. So for today, our very first episode, we are tackling Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones. Well, and it's interesting because, this book came out exactly, 21 years ago. And today, even when I mentioned the title to different people, I mean, they immediately recognize it. So I think that qualifies it as a classic.
I think people that weren't even born when it was published recognize the name because, again, it was turned into a very popular movie.
That's right.
And it's just part of, maybe they were rediscovering the movie on Netflix, or they're, even reading the book again. Like it's just one of those books that turns up.
It does. So is it still classic? So Susan and I are going to debate. At the end, we will take our votes and do yes or no, whether or not this will be considered still a classic. So let's just rehash for those of you that aren't very familiar with Alice Sebold and The Lovely Bones. The plot really follows a 14-year-old girl who very early on in the narrative gets kidnapped, raped, and killed. So, I mean, a horrific story. And the rest of the novel follows her voice as she is in this in-between place in the next world, and she follows her family and the aftermath of her disappearance.
That's a pretty great summary.
Right. So it's interesting. It's a first person narrative. It's told from a young child and is told in essentially from the great hereafter. So there's a very interesting voice. The book sold over 10 million copies in hardcover when it came out as a debut novel, which is pretty unheard of.
Yeah,
right?
It was a huge hit.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go back to 2002 when it first came out. Sold over 10 million copies, was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year. 2002 was an interesting time. So we'll talk a little bit about the reception would be like today. But back then, it was a year after 9/11. There was a lot going on in the news at the time. There was, who was that disappearance?
Yeah, it's in The Guardian they wrote about.
Oh, yeah, in The Guardian. So it was, there was a time when it was very interesting. It was very appealing for people to maybe imagine that their loved ones were still reachable or watching them or connected to them in the great, Elizabeth Smart also. It was after the disappearance of Elizabeth Smart. So, I'll just say coyly that, white girls going missing in the news or dead was kind of a thing at the time. Right?
It really was. And the line was like the reassurance and satisfaction of being able to hear the voice of the gone and piece together the future after cataclysm. That was in the review in The Guardian.
Right. So, okay. I mean, we can talk about the other reviews at the time. The Kirkus review, I mean, it's interesting. As I was going back and reading all the reviews, they were kind of hesitatingly fawning. Like they knew the book was going to do very well. Yeah. but there was a bit of a reluctance in actually kind of listing it as like a runaway critical success, because the book had some challenges, right?
It definitely had some challenges, and it had some sentence to sentence writing flaws, for lack of a better word. This writer has been singled out for the poor quality of her similes and metaphors.
Right. I mean, it's funny. I did highlight some places that I kind of got stuck. I mean, she's watching, from heaven essentially, or, in between heaven, her sister having sex. And, she talks about, in the walls of my sex, there was horror and blood, and the walls of hers, there were windows. I mean, I found that sentence so awkward. I mean, it's a curious thing to have a 14-year-old girl kind of yearn for sex when she was raped in heaven. It's a weird thing. So
it's weird to think about.
Now, okay, so I read the book 21 years ago. Sue, you never read the book?
I did not read the book.
And it's interesting. So this is a reread for me. I don't remember. I didn't remember it in exactly, but I do remember the initial scene where she is kidnapped and raped, and it has haunted me for 21 years. I mean, that scene is brutal. Like, do you remember that scene?
I started when I was reading this book, I found it so upsetting. I literally skipped the pages.
I know it's horrible, and so I think it's very different reading it before we were mothers.
Yeah.
And now reading it after, when we are mothers, I think we have a very different experience.
I wasn't shocked to find that the author herself had not had children, because I don't think you could have children and then write that. Like, I'm not saying you couldn't, but it would be so painful to do.
Right.
Like, it would be a real artistic feat. I'm not saying you shouldn't or you couldn't. I'm just saying it was very difficult as a parent to read that.
Yeah, no, it was a very hard section. And it was a little bit painful to watch her parents
oh my God,
fall apart after her disappearance. So I know the book is following her family. I mean, what did you think? What did you think about that part?
Well, I mean, I think it was an probably quite accurate picture of the way people might cope differently within a family with the disappearance of a loved one. Again, it wasn't my favorite, because part of me was like, why do I need to put this into my head? It's so dark and painful. But there is a lot about the book that is more uplifting than that. There's a lot about healing and recovery. And of course, you're not going to get to the value of the healing and recovery without talking about the reality of what the pain of losing a child or a sister, or, a friend, because all of those people, like, this book has a large cast. That's all I'm going to say.
That's very, very true.
But everyone has this ripple. Her death has this ripple effect on her whole community. And that was interesting to see, because, we all want to believe we all matter in some way. And for Susie up in heaven looking down, she's seeing how her brief life had an impact.
Right. No, that's true. And so we should chat a little bit about Alice Sebold herself. I mean, this was her debut novel, but it was not her first book. She wrote a memoir before this called Lucky, which captures, it's a memoir about her life. And she was horrifically raped as a freshman, I believe, or when she was 18, quite young. And that had a huge impact, obviously, on her life and on her writing. And I think, I do wonder in retrospect how much of the appeal of the book was this voyeuristic look into what it was like for a rape victim to write about rape victims.
Yeah, right? I think that is definitely part of it. And, her memoir didn't take off at the time, but once The Lovely Bones came out, it right away was part of the story of the book.
Right. So they're very intertwined. And I think it was positioned very much like, here is the true story, and here is the literary interpretation of the story. Even though Susie Salmon is 14, she's clearly a child. She was killed. It was positioned kind of as like two sides of the same coin, right? Yes,
I think it was. And because in both cases, these are not these are cases where someone is raped by either a stranger, which was the case for Alice Sebold, or by like basically a psycho child killer.
Right.
They're not, how would I put this? They're very like cut and dried
Correct.
rape cases,
right,
where the victim is clearly, no one can be in any doubt about the victim's, innocence, undeserving of this terrible thing. Then the story gets a little more complicated for Alice Sebold.
Correct.
When you're thinking about who was really also victimized in the process. So Leah, maybe you want to sum that up.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, I mean, you can Google the story. Months after her assault, Alice Sebold was walking down the street. She spotted a man who she was convinced was her rapist. She went to the police. If I recall correctly, she could not pick him out in a lineup again afterwards, but due to some shoddy science, he was convicted of her rape and went to jail for a very long time. So, I mean, he was... and we're talking from 1981, and the case was overturned in 2021, like really like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
He served, and he was insistent throughout the duration of his time in prison that he was innocent of all crimes. Turns out he was innocent of all crimes. He was recently, as in just this year, awarded $5.5 million in a lawsuit, which seems like a very paltry amount to destroy someone's life. So Alice Sebold, in terms of this, in this case, in terms of the Anthony Broadwater's case, she does seem, I was trying to read some interviews about that. She does seem contrite, or not contrite. She seems saddened that justice was not served in that case, and she positions it as justice failing both of them. It's hard, and perhaps we don't want to cast blame on the victim, but it's interesting. Perhaps the time that no one took into consideration the trauma that she was under, how quickly she would be motivated to try and find a perpetrator, very much like the novel, actually.
Yeah, actually, because the desire to identify the perpetrator, to have this person punished when you're sure who it is, but you don't have the proof that you need.
Right.
And the fantasies of vengeance that the characters, left behind have.
Right.
I thought that was pretty interesting. The portrait of what kind of vengeance the father in particular wished for, and how it was really you can really see how that gets in the way of him moving on.
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting also the way she positioned that, because, and I think right now it would have been interpreted maybe better, but at the time it was interesting. There was the father who couldn't move on, and the mother who desperately wanted to. And we have so much, especially coming up to Mother's Day tomorrow, there's so much in our collective psyche about what responsibilities mothers have. You would expect the roles at that time to have been reversed, but they weren't, which I think was interesting, that the mother was like, she needed to kind of make a break. And actually, interestingly, and this is, I guess, a spoiler, abandoned her family.
Yeah.
But, abandoned her family in an attempt to save herself, which I think I view a lot more favorably as a mother after all these years than I probably did back then. But it's interesting that it was the father who was just so single-mindedly focused on this brutal, understandably, but also with the inability to move on.
They have 2 other children. And
Right.
So at one point, one of the kids says to the dad, "We're still here. We're still alive." And I thought that was a really great scene, because, I remember my own mother feeling like when her father died when she was 12, she felt like she lost both parents, because her mother basically just was, too stricken to really be present for a long time after that. And I think that when that happens in a family, it must be devastating for the children left behind for so many other reasons, so many reasons.
For sure. So I just want to touch on it briefly, since it's been, in the news and we've been chatting about it for a while, is, I kind of reread this book with Claire Dederer in mind. So Claire Dederer, if you haven't come across her, she just recently wrote a book called Monsters: A Fan's Dilemma. And the thesis is essentially, how do we perceive art when we know that the artist has done some bad things, or may have been not like the nicest individual, or may have, how do you love Polanski and still acknowledge that he's a rapist? So, she talks about this fan's dilemma, and I don't want to castigate Alice Sebold, but it is interesting because so much of the, celebrity status of the books revolves around her rape, and then this other man's life is crushed in the interim.
Yeah.
So, does that change your perception of the book in any way?
It makes me think that, she would be canceled if that was, if the book came out today and that was known about her, then that would happen kind of right away. In one way you can say, well, she had a close-up seat to the trauma, to the police investigation, which is part of this book.
Sure.
There's a lot of realism in the story. And obviously the fact that she got the identification wrong doesn't change what, the trauma of what she went through. But I just, it's such a miscarriage of justice. It's hard to
it is
feel good about it.
Truly heartbreaking. And it's truly heartbreaking. I almost wish she would write more about that. We haven't seen, as far as we can tell, she hasn't written books in a few years. It would be interesting if she were able to. There's no doubt the long-term impact that rape can have on an individual, and I don't want to diminish that, but it would be interesting to show the ripple effects of that miscarriage of justice in a fictional way.
And also knowing that the person that raped you is still walking around when you thought that they had been caught.
You're absolutely right. And I wonder, that must be really unsettling, really unsettling as well. It's
not a cheerful book. It's not a really happy story. Although many people do describe it as uplifting, because it does show the healing that takes place over time.
Right.
And the way people move on, and that many people in the book go on to have, happy lives, meaningful lives, with the memory of their relative or friend still alive in their hearts, but not breaking their hearts every day.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about it. If it came out today, how would it be received?
Well, I think the writing would not stand today. This book is 675 pages on my digital version. And I would say you could cut 250 pages without blinking an eye. You could cut sentences like the one that referred to someone buttering her toast with her tears.
Right.
That one jumped out at me as a bad metaphor. It's very long and it has too many characters. It would be my impression. Someone would say, this is clearly a first novel that needed more editing and rewrites.
Yeah, I do agree. And I also think from a subject matter standpoint, I don't think it would fly. I think the first person I think it would come across, and this is going to sound weird because of the violence in it, but more as a YA novel, because it is told from the perspective of the young girl, who is kind of, it's that from the hereafter, it's there's a bit of a revenge fantasy in there. And I think the writing was, maybe it would appeal to more of a YA type. You have to tamper some of the scenes, but it would appeal more to a YA author. I also didn't love the writing. I also agreed it was really long, and perhaps they've just gotten used to reading shorter books. I don't know. There's also the controversy of, would you, and I know we've dealt with it in the public discourse over the last 20 years, but, there are fascination with missing white girls. I don't know if that would play very well. I think it would. I think there'd be more of a conversation of why are we focused on this girl versus other girls? Because, of course, there are girls that are kidnapped and killed all the time. Perhaps not by strangers. I think that's still quite rare, but by people they know.
Yeah, I would say you mentioned that this is quite rare, and it is quite rare, but the book really leans into this sort of, this is a crazy serial killer. And guess what he does? He builds doll houses. He's so kind of classically creepy that that I think that wouldn't fly today either. People would be like, you know what? This is like a fairy tale, and he's a fairy tale villain.
He is a fairy tale villain. I think there are moments where she does offer like a very hint of complexity to him, about showing his upbringing. It does fall flat. There is very much a dichotomy in this book of good versus evil. Evil, the good does win out in the end. So it is kind of a happy story in a weird sort of way. I guess you touched on that.
Yeah.
But would it be published today? My sense is maybe as a YA novel.
Yeah, I think it would probably be published in the sense that, let's face it, these kind of books do sell.
Okay,
they
true,
still
true.
sell.
Yeah.
And it is, I wouldn't call it a page turner, but it, because there is the man remains at large for almost the entire novel, you are like, well, what's going to happen? Are they going to catch him? Are they going to catch him before he kills again? Like, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
So that mystery was what kept me reading, much more so than how is this girl going to get out of whatever limbo she's in, and how is everybody going to move on? I was like, surely they're going to wrap up that plot.
Yeah, I think that was really what keeps you going throughout the book, is to find out, do they catch him? And in that case, it is more, has some thriller elements there. So I think that does keep you wanting to read to the end.
Yes. I didn't enjoy finishing it, but I didn't have trouble finishing it. I was kind of driven to finish it and see what happened.
So in terms of a reread, I mean, I remember thinking I remember being blown away by it 21 years ago. So I was not blown away today, but it was still, there were still moments where I thought, wow, especially the early scenes, very hard to write, very hard to read, but I think very well captured. The first 50 pages I thought were really, really strong. I think you're right. It goes on a bit too long, but I think there is a lot of merit, but not as well as I remembered it. So I'm hinting towards my answer.
And I think mine is coming up pretty clear.
Okay. So should we ask,
got our buttons.
Is this still a classic?
1, 2, 1.
3.
No.
Okay. I guess we answered ourselves. I think we would say
No.
Oh, sorry.
The Lovely Bones, not still a classic.
Not still a classic. Okay. But still worth the read. And,
Yeah. Like, it's worth the discussion. I'm not sorry I read it.
I think that's all.
Yeah.
I'm not sorry I read it. Okay. Until next time, thank you very much for tuning in. Susan Catto, Leah Eichler. We are from Esoterica Magazine, and this is our podcast, Still a Classic. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.